In the flickering candlelight of a military field hospital, Dr. Jean-Pierre Dufour watched in horror as his patient's jaw unhinged like a serpent's, swallowing a live cat whole in one grotesque gulp. Was this man suffering from an extreme medical condition, or had something far more sinister taken residence in human flesh? When a child vanishes from the camp and accusations of demonic possession spread like wildfire, Dufour must choose between the rational world of science and the terrifying possibility that some hungers cannot be explained by medicine alone. The year is 1794. The French Republic is at war with the world, and the world is pushing back. Near the front lines in Souchez, the air itself is a casualty, thick with the metallic tang of blood, the sour rot of infection, and the cloying sweetness of unsterilized linen. This is the domain of the military field hospital, a canvas city of suffering pitched on muddy ground, a place where men arrive in pieces and are lucky to leave at all. Through this sensory hell, Dr. Jean-Pierre Dufour moved like a ghost of pure reason. At 40, his eyes were sharp, his movements economical, his entire being a bulwark against the chaos he waded through each day. He heard the screams, of course, the desperate prayers to a God who had long since deserted these fields. He simply chose not to listen. He filtered them out, relegated them to the background noise of a world gone mad. His focus was on the flesh, the bone, the intricate broken machinery of the human body. He stood over a young grenadier, no older than 20, whose leg had been shattered by canister shot. The bone was a white, jagged ruin protruding from a mess of muscle and cloth. The boy was conscious, his knuckles white as he gripped the sides of his cot, his teeth grinding to dust. Another surgeon might have offered a word of comfort, a meaningless platitude. Dufour offered only precision. "Forceps," he said, his voice calm and even, cutting through the boy's ragged breathing. A nervous, sweat-soaked orderly slapped the instrument into his waiting palm. Note for the record: compound fracture of the right tibia and fibula, extensive tissue damage. The risk of sepsis is... He paused, peering closer. 70%. Amputation is the only viable course. He spoke not to the boy, but to the orderly, to the historical record, to science itself. The body on the cot was not a person, it was a problem. A puzzle of broken parts to be solved, or if unsolvable, to be discarded. His hands, steady as stone, began the work. He was a master craftsman, and this was his workshop. The screams were merely the sound of his materials. In a world of butchery, Jean-Pierre Dufour was a scientist, and science, he believed, was the only thing that could save any of them. His work was interrupted by a different orderly, one bearing a summons, not a scalpel. Commandant Lefebvre wished to see him. Dufour meticulously cleaned his instruments, gave curt instructions for the post-operative care of the now one-legged grenadier, and strode toward the command tent, his boots making clean, decisive sounds in the mud. The Commandant's office was an island of Spartan order in the ocean of chaos. The desk was clear, the papers were stacked, the maps were folded. Lefebvre, a man whose thinning hair and perpetual frown spoke of a life spent battling budgets and supply lines, did not believe in pleasantries. He saw the world as a ledger, and his job was to keep it balanced. "Dufour," he grunted, gesturing to a simple wooden stool. "Sit." Dufour sat. "We have a problem," Lefebvre began, his fingers steepled. "A logistical problem wearing a soldier's uniform. A private by the name of Tarrare." Dufour waited, his face a neutral mask of professional curiosity. "The man eats," Lefebvre said, as if the word itself were an obscenity. "And I don't mean he has a healthy appetite. I mean he eats. He was assigned to this company 3 weeks ago. In that time, he has consumed his own ration, the rations of at least 3 other men, and has been repeatedly caught foraging in the waste pits like a dog. He eats the poultices, the discarded bandages. The quartermaster reports that our weekly consumption of bread has quadrupled." "Quadrupled!" Lefebvre leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. He is a drain, Doctor. A freak. I cannot have a man who functions as a walking hole in my supply chain. The men are spooked by him. They call him unnatural. He waved a dismissive hand. I need this problem solved. I need you to diagnose him, and I need you to cure him. Find out what is wrong with this gluttonous worm and fix it, so I can either put him back on the line or discharge him from my books entirely. Dufour felt a flicker of something not sympathy, but intellectual intrigue, a medical anomaly, a puzzle. I will need to examine the patient, he said simply. He's not a patient, Lefebvre corrected, his voice flat. He is an inefficiency. See to it. The interview was over. Dufour was dismissed, the Commandant already turning his attention to a column of figures on a fresh sheet of paper. For Lefebvre, it was an issue of accounting. For Dufour, it was now a case, a violation of the natural order that demanded a rational, scientific explanation. Two guards stood outside a small, isolated tent, set well away from the others. They wore expressions of deep disgust. As Dufour approached, one of them spat on the ground. "Be careful in there, Doctor," he muttered. "It ain't right." Dufour ignored him and pulled back the tent flap. The smell hit him first, a wave of heat and a stench so foul, so uniquely offensive, it made his stomach clench. It was a rank, corrupt odor of sweat and decay, the smell of a body consuming itself. Inside, sitting on a cot, was Tarrare. The sight of him was a paradox that defied all logic. For a man accused of such prodigious consumption, he was shockingly, skeletally thin. His skin, pale and clammy, hung from his bones in loose folds, as if he belonged to a much larger man. His hair was lank and thin, his cheekbones sharp ridges. But it was his mouth that was most arresting. It was unnaturally wide, his lips thin and almost colorless, stretching into a vast, gaping maw. His eyes were listless, bovine, but they locked onto Dufour and followed his every movement with a disturbing, vacant intensity. "Private Tarrare," Dufour said, his voice all business. "I am Dr. Dufour. I'm here to examine you." Tarrare did not respond. He simply stared, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. Dufour began his work, maintaining a professional distance. He took Tarrare's pulse. It was rapid. He placed a hand on his forehead. The skin was burning, his body temperature far above normal. The foul odor seemed to radiate from Tarrare's pores. Dufour made notes in his journal, his mind already cycling through possibilities. A tapeworm of unprecedented size, a glandular disorder, a malformation of the digestive tract. Every theory was an attempt to cage the phenomenon in the familiar language of medicine. He turned his back for a single moment, uncorking a small vial of smelling salts from his medical bag to clear his head of the stench. In that instant, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A stray cat, one of the many that scavenged the camp, had slipped under the tent flap, perhaps drawn by some morbid curiosity. It took 2 steps into the tent. Before Dufour could even shout, Tarrare moved. It wasn't a human motion. It was a lunge, silent and lethally fast, like a striking snake. His impossibly wide mouth opened, unhinging like a reptile S. He seized the cat in his jaws. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a single, choked-off squeal. Dufour watched, frozen, his scientific mind short-circuiting. Tarrare's throat convulsed. He swallowed once, twice, and the cat was gone. There was no chewing, no tearing, just gone, devoured whole. Tarrare settled back onto his cot. He licked his thin lips, a smear of blood and fur at the corner of his mouth. Then he looked at Dufour, his eyes as empty and placid as before, as if nothing had happened. The vial of smelling salts slipped from Dufour's numb fingers and shattered on the packed earth floor. The sharp, ammoniac scent filled the tent, but it did nothing to erase the image seared into his brain. This wasn't a disorder. It wasn't a disease he could find in any of his books. This was a violation, a monstrous biological impossibility. For the first time in his career, Dr. Jean-Pierre Dufour stood face to face with a phenomenon for which he had no name, and the solid ground of his rational world had just given way to a terrifying, fathomless abyss. That night, Dufour's study felt less like a sanctuary and more like the last bastion of a dying worldview. The anatomical charts on the walls, with their neat lines and confident labels, seemed to mock him. The medical texts, filled with the accumulated knowledge of centuries, offered no comfort. All he could see was the image of the cat, the sickening convulsion of Tarrare's throat, and the placid emptiness in his eyes afterward. He had tried to write his report, to reduce the event to a series of clinical observations, but the words felt like lies. The flap to his tent was pulled back, and Baron Percy stepped inside, a pipe in his hand and a look of concern on his face. Percy was a senior surgeon, a man who had seen as much horror as Dufour, but had somehow retained a spark of curiosity that Dufour had long since extinguished in himself. "The guards are telling stories, Jean-Pierre," Percy said, his voice low. "Wild ones." Dufour ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the composure he fought so hard to maintain. "What I saw was anomalous." "So I hear," Percy said, lighting his pipe. The sweet scent of tobacco filled the small space, a feeble defense against the lingering miasma of the hospital. "I believe it is a case of extreme polyphagia," Dufour began, the textbook term feeling clumsy and inadequate on his tongue. He was forcing the chaos into a box, a pathological disorder of the appetite, perhaps a malformation of the stomach, an organ that can expand to an unprecedented degree, or a psychological compulsion, a hysteria manifesting as insatiable hunger. He laid out the theories, the rational explanations, the scientific possibilities. He spoke of Tarrare as a patient, a collection of symptoms to be catalogued and understood. He pointedly dismissed the soldier's whispers of demons and curses as the predictable fear of the uneducated. Percy listened patiently, puffing on his pipe. When Dufour finished, the older man looked at him, his eyes full of a wisdom that went beyond textbooks. A stomach that digests bone and fur in an instant. A psychological compulsion that grants him the speed of a viper. "Your boxes are well made, Jean-Pierre, but are you certain this phenomenon fits inside one?" He didn't press the point. He simply asked the questions Dufour couldn't yet bring himself to face, the questions that hovered in the dark corners of the study, just beyond the reach of his lamp. Dufour decided the only answer lay in data, hard, quantifiable data. 2 days later, he arranged his first formal experiment. In the center of the mess hall, on a long, empty table, he and his orderlies laid out a feast fit for a garrison, a meal intended for 15 laborers, 2 enormous wheels of cheese, 4 feet of bread, a dozen pounds of salted beef, and gallons of milk. Every item was weighed and measured. This was not a meal. It was an equation. On one side was the food, a known quantity. On the other side was Tarrare. He was brought in under guard and seated at the table. He did not look at the feast with relish or excitement. He simply looked at it, his vacant eyes taking in the mountain of food. Dufour, Percy, and a handful of guards stood back, watching. "Begin," Dufour said. What followed was not eating, it was demolition. Tarrare did not savor, he did not chew, he simply consumed. His jaw unhinged, his throat worked, and the food vanished. The bread disappeared in great, unchewed hunks. He gnawed the beef from the bone, swallowing fist-sized chunks. He crammed entire wedges of cheese into his gaping mouth. There was no pleasure in it, only a relentless mechanical efficiency. The sounds were wet and horrifying. In less than 20 minutes, the platter was empty. The table was clean. The observers stood in stunned silence. Dufour's neat calculations, his scientific measurements, were rendered utterly meaningless. Tarrare wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, looked directly at Dufour, and then made a slow, deliberate gesture, rubbing his flat stomach. He was still hungry. He wanted more. Dufour felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This was not a man with a large appetite. This was a walking void. That night, Dufour was jolted from a restless sleep by shouts from the surgical ward. He grabbed his coat and ran, his mind already fearing the worst. He burst into the ward to find a scene of grotesque chaos. Tarrare was there, having slipped his guards. He was on his knees, stuffing his mouth with used, blood-soaked bandages he'd pulled from a waste bin. He was chewing on a discarded poultice, his lips smeared with its foul-smelling paste. Before him stood Sister Agnes, the devout, iron-willed nun, who ran the ward with a faith as sharp as any scalpel. She held a large wooden crucifix in front of her like a shield, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Do you see now, Doctor?" she cried, her voice trembling with conviction. "This is not the hunger of the flesh. This is the hunger of the damned. He consumes filth to mock God's creations. He eats suffering because he is its source. This is a demon in our midst." She thrust the crucifix toward Tarrare. "This boy needs an exorcist, not a physician." Dufour tried to argue, to speak of pathology and compulsion, of the scientific method, but the words felt hollow. A flimsy shield of reason against the raw, terrifying power of the scene before him. He was a man of science, facing a woman of faith, and between them was a creature on its knees, devouring refuse in the flickering lamplight. For the first time, Dufour's certainty wavered, and in that moment of doubt, he felt a profound, chilling fear that Sister Agnes might be right. His desperation for answers drove him to a more radical test. He needed to know the limits, the boundaries of this biological blasphemy. The next day, with Commandant Lefebvre and Baron Percy observing from a safe distance, Dufour conducted his next experiment in the isolation tent. He offered Tarrare a live eel, nearly 3 feet long, writhing in a bucket. Tarrare plunged his hand into the bucket, grabbed the creature, and brought it to his mouth. With a sickening crunch that echoed in the quiet tent, he crushed the eel's skull with his teeth. Then, as with the cat, his throat began to work. He swallowed the thrashing, muscular body whole. Percy looked away, disgusted, but Commandant Lefebvre leaned forward, a glint in his eye. He was not a man of science or faith. He was a man of utility, and he had just seen something useful, incredible, the Commandant murmured. "Doctor, could he swallow a document? A sealed message, perhaps?" Dufour was appalled. "Commandant, this is a patient, a sick man, not a courier pouch." Lefebvre completely ignored him. The medical mystery was of no interest to him. The potential application, however, was everything. He had just witnessed a living, breathing form of cryptography, a man who could carry a secret message inside his own stomach, impervious to any search. "This is no longer your concern, Doctor," Lefebvre said, his voice carrying the cold weight of absolute authority. He turned to a guard. "Fetch me a small wooden box," and a lock. The scientific experiment had been hijacked. The quest for understanding had been corrupted into a test of military exploitation. Dufour stood, powerless, as his patient was about to be turned into a tool, his search for a diagnosis twisted into a Weapon S trial. He had lost control, not just of the experiment, but of the man himself. The following day, the hospital courtyard was turned into a makeshift theatre for an audience of the morbidly curious. Soldiers and staff gathered at a distance, their faces a mixture of fascination and revulsion. In the center of the courtyard stood Commandant Lefebvre, holding a small wooden box, no bigger than a man's fist, secured with a simple lock. Beside him, Dr. Dufour stood stiffly, his face a mask of clinical detachment that betrayed none of the profound unease churning in his gut. This was not science. This was a spectacle, a perversion of his craft. Yet he could not bring himself to look away. He had to see. He had to know. Tarrare was led out, blinking in the daylight. Lefebvre presented the box to him as one might offer a treat to a dog. Without a flicker of emotion, Tarrare took it, placed it in his impossibly wide mouth, and swallowed. The act was seamless, grotesque, and utterly silent. The crowd gasped. The next 24 hours were a tense, bizarre vigil. Tarrare was kept under constant watch, fed his enormous rations, and observed. Dufour found himself complicit in the Commandant's crude experiment, dutifully examining Tarrare's excrement. A task so demeaning, so far removed from the noble pursuit of medicine, that he felt a hot flush of shame every time he performed it. Then it came. Tucked within a foul-smelling mass, the wooden box emerged, slimy but intact. A guard, his face wrinkled in disgust, retrieved it with a pair of tongs and washed it in a bucket of water. He presented it to the Commandant. Lefebvre took a key from his pocket, unlocked the box, and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He smoothed it out and read the message he himself had written the day before. He looked up, a thin, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Success," he declared to the assembled officers. A strange, perverse sense of victory hung in the air. The experiment had worked. The anomaly had performed as predicted. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that Tarrare's condition, as bizarre as it was, could be understood, quantified, and utilized. It was a victory not for medicine, but for a twisted kind of military science, a victory that made Dufour feel more defeated than ever. He had gathered his data, but he had compromised his soul to do it. The fragile, grotesque order was shattered at dusk by a single, piercing scream. It was a sound of pure, undiluted anguish that sliced through the weary quiet of the hospital. It came from the direction of the surgical ward. Panic erupted like a fever. Dufour, his heart seizing in his chest, ran toward the sound. He found a young woman, a laundress, on her knees in the grass, tearing at her hair. She was hysterical, her cries devolving into incoherent sobs. Other staff members surrounded her, their faces pale with shock. The story came out in frantic, broken pieces. The woman's daughter, a small child of only 14 months, had been playing in the grass just outside the ward while her mother worked. The mother had looked away for no more than a minute, and when she looked back, the child was gone. The abstract, fascinating mystery of Tarrare, the strange medical curiosity that had been the subject of gossip and experiment, suddenly became a concrete and terrifying threat. The controlled environment of the hospital dissolved into a vortex of primal fear. Torches were lit. Soldiers and staff fanned out, their search patterns chaotic and desperate, their shouts echoing into the growing darkness. They searched the tents, the woods, the ditches, their movements growing more frantic with every passing minute that yielded nothing. The air grew thick with a new kind of dread, a dread that had a name and a face and lived in an isolated tent at the edge of the camp. The search lasted for hours. It was fruitless. The night grew deeper, the mood darker. The search parties began to drift back to the main courtyard, their torches converging into a single angry constellation. They were no longer a search party. They were a mob. Their fear, unallayed by discovery, had curdled into a desperate need for an explanation, for a target. Into the center of this simmering crowd stepped Sister Agnes. Her face was grim, her eyes filled with a terrible certainty. She raised a trembling hand and pointed, not at a clue, not at a location, but at the single, isolated tent that everyone was already thinking of. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a shout, but it carried across the entire courtyard, clear and chilling as a funeral bell. The demon was hungry. The words fell into the silence like a stone into a deep well. The accusation was absolute, biblical. It was the answer everyone subconsciously craved, a simple, terrifying explanation for an inexplicable horror. It required no proof, no evidence, only fear, and fear was in abundant supply. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like fire through dry grass. The demon, he took the child, he ate the child. The whispers grew into a chant, a low, menacing roar that rose into the night sky. All eyes, filled with a mixture of terror and righteous fury, turned as one toward Tarrare's tent. The superstition that had been simmering for weeks had finally boiled over, and it was about to consume everything in its path. Inside the tent, the roar of the mob was a physical presence, a wave of sound that made the canvas walls tremble. Dufour stood over Tarrare, who was huddled on his cot, whimpering at the noise. The flap was thrown open, and Commandant Lefebvre entered, flanked by 2 armed guards. His face was a thundercloud. "This has gone far enough," Lefebvre snarled, his eyes fixed not on Tarrare, but on Dufour. "There is no proof," Dufour protested, his voice strained. "This is madness, a witch hunt." "The proof," Lefebvre shot back, gesturing with his head toward the roaring crowd, "is that I have a riot brewing 50 feet from my office. I will not have my command descend into chaos because of your pet monster." He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a tone of cold finality. "As of this moment, this thing is no longer your patient. He is a murder suspect." Dufour felt the blood drain from his face. "You cannot be serious. On the word of a hysterical nun, on the basis of fear." Lefebvre's eyes were like chips of ice. "Their fear is all the proof I need, Doctor. It is the only thing that is real out there right now." He turned to the guards. "Chain him. Take him to the brig. He is to be interrogated until he confesses." Dufour stood, stunned into silence, as the guards roughly seized Tarrare, clamping heavy iron shackles on his wrists. His scientific authority, his rank as an officer, his appeals to reason, they were all meaningless. The forces of irrationality and fear, weaponized by a cynical commander desperate to maintain order, had won. The problem he had been assigned to solve, the fascinating anomaly he had tried to cage with logic and method, had now broken free of his control and consumed him entirely. His goal was no longer to understand Tarrare, it was to somehow save him from the gallows. And as he watched them drag the weeping, terrified man out of the tent and into the wrath of the mob, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had already failed. The brig was a place where reason went to die. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of wet stone and human misery. Tarrare was chained to the wall of a cramped cell, the iron shackles raw against his pale, thin wrists. He was no longer a medical anomaly. He was a piece of evidence to be broken. Commandant Lefebvre's guards, men who solved problems with fists and boot leather, conducted the interrogation. Dr. Dufour was forced to stand and watch, a powerless observer. He was forbidden to interfere. The guards screamed questions at Tarrare, their faces inches from his. "Where is the child? What did you do with her? Confess, you devil." When the screaming failed, the violence began. They backhanded him across his unnaturally wide mouth. They kicked him in his hollow stomach. Dufour flinched with every blow. He tried to step forward, to protest on medical grounds, to argue that the subject was in no condition for this. "This is not an interrogation," he said, his voice tight with fury. "It is torture. You will get nothing from him this way." A guard shoved him back against the damp wall. "Stay out of it, Doctor. This is military justice." Dufour tried to see past the guards, to perform a visual examination, to look for any physical sign or clue, but it was impossible. He could only watch as the rational system of military justice became an engine of blind persecution. Tarrare did not confess. He did not speak at all. He only whimpered, curling into himself like a beaten dog. To the guards, his silence was not the result of terror or incomprehension. It was proof of an inhuman, demonic guilt. To Dufour, it was the final brutal dissolution of the line between civilized order and the superstitious mob baying outside the gates. They were one and the same. That night, Dufour's study was a prison. He paced the small space, the neat rows of books and charts offering no answers, only accusations of his own failure. He was at the end of his rope, a man of science who had run out of science. He had lost his patient, he had lost his authority, and he was losing his mind. Baron Percy found him there, staring blankly at an anatomical chart of the human digestive system, as if it were written in a foreign language. "It's over, Percy," Dufour said, his voice hollow. "They will hang him. My methods, my observations, my entire discipline, it is all useless against fear." He slumped onto a stool, the very picture of defeat. "I have no answers." Percy slowly lit his pipe, the familiar ritual a small point of calm in the storm. "Then perhaps, Jean-Pierre," the older doctor said gently, "you have been asking the wrong questions." He paused, letting the smoke curl around his head. "You have spent all your energy trying to prove your own hypothesis that this is a medical condition. You have failed. So now, you must do what any good scientist does when his theory collapses." Dufour looked up, confused. "What is that?" Percy leaned forward, his eyes serious. "You must try with all your skill to prove the alternative. If you cannot prove your hypothesis, you must try to disprove theirs. Treat their superstition as a theory. Assume for a moment that Sister Agnes is right. Assume Tarrare is a demon. And then investigate. Where does this demon come from? What are its habits? What are its weaknesses? Use their belief as your guide and see where it leads. The only way to kill a ghost, my friend, is to hunt it." The next day, Dufour found Sister Agnes in the small, quiet chapel. Kneeling before a simple wooden cross, he did not approach her with the arrogant condescension of their last encounter, but with the humility of a student. He knelt in the pew behind her and waited. When she finished her prayers, she turned and saw him. Her eyes were wary. "I need your help, sister," Dufour said, his voice quiet and sincere. "You spoke of a demon, a goulet. I need you to tell me everything you know." Seeing the desperation and genuine curiosity in his face, her expression softened. She sat down with him in the quiet, dusty chapel. She told him the old stories, the folklore of the region passed down through generations. The goulet, she explained, was a spirit of insatiable hunger, a creature that lurked in the shadows between civilization and the wild. It was drawn to places of suffering, like battlefields and hospitals. It hid in damp, dark places, near running water, where it could wash away the filth of its deeds. It was cunning, she said, but it was also a creature of habit, following ancient, predictable paths. Dufour listened, his pen scratching away in his medical journal. He took notes on folklore next to sketches of the human stomach. He wrote down the demon's supposed habits next to his own clinical observations of Tarrare's symptoms. He was a man of science, conducting an ethnographic study of a supernatural being, applying his systematic mind to a field of pure, unsystematic belief. He was crossing a threshold within himself, and he did not know what he would find on the other side. That night, the fragile peace of the hospital was broken for good. The mob, its numbers swollen by off-duty soldiers and fueled by cheap wine and impatience, decided that military justice was too slow. They wanted their own. Carrying torches and improvised weapons, pitchforks, meat cleavers, heavy clubs, they stormed the brig, overwhelming the few guards on duty. Dufour, warned by Percy, who had heard the rising anger in the camp, arrived moments before them. He saw the hate in their eyes, the drunken bloodlust. They were going to tear Tarrare limb from limb. In that moment, something inside Dufour snapped. He was no longer a detached observer. He was a protector. He planted himself in front of Tarrare's cell door, his arms outstretched. "Get back!" he roared, his voice filled with an authority he didn't know he possessed. "You will not pass. This man is a prisoner of the French Republic under my medical authority." He argued, he reasoned. He threatened them with court-martial and the wrath of the Commandant. He used his intellect like a sword, his officer's rank like a shield, holding back the tide of raw, violent emotion. The narrow corridor was a chaotic scene of shouting, shoving, and the menacing flicker of torchlight. In the pandemonium, no one saw it. A heavy blow from a club, meant for Dufour, had struck the heavy iron lock on Tarrare's cell door, cracking the rusted hasp. In the ensuing chaos, as Dufour desperately held the mob at bay, the weakened door swung silently inward. By the time Dufour had finally forced the mob into a temporary, grumbling retreat, it was too late. He turned to the cell, his heart pounding. The door was ajar, the cell was empty. The chains lay broken on the floor. Tarrare was gone, having slipped out a small window at the back of the cell during the riot. A cold wave of panic washed over Dufour. Tarrare was loose. The mob would regroup. The Commandant would send out kill squads. Dufour was now operating completely outside the system, a rogue element in a world gone mad. He had to find Tarrare first. He had to. Grabbing a lantern, he plunged into the darkness, racing against the mob, the military, and the terrifying unknown truth. The woods were a black, tangled maze, and Dufour plunged into them with the desperation of a drowning man. He ran, his lantern casting wild, dancing shadows, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The shouts of the mob and the signal horns of the military patrols echoed behind him, a fearsome chorus driving him deeper into the wilderness. But he wasn't running blindly. He was following a map that no sane man would trust. He ignored the well-trod paths, the logical routes of escape. Instead, he listened to the voice of Sister Agnes in his memory. The goulet lurks near running water, it hides in the damp darkness. He pushed through thorn bushes and over fallen logs, making his way down into a steep, muddy ravine where a small stream trickled over slick rocks. It was a place of shadows and strange sounds, a place that felt ancient and wrong. And it was there, in the deepest part of the ravine, that he found him. Tarrare was not feasting. He was not performing some demonic ritual. He was huddled inside a wide stone drainage culvert, shivering uncontrollably, his knees drawn up to his chest. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly terrified. The monster from the mob's imagination, the demon from Sister Agnes' folklore, was just a profoundly sick and frightened boy hiding in a ditch. Dufour knew synthesized method had worked. The superstitious map had led him right where he needed to go. "Tarrare," Dufour said softly, his voice gentle. He held the lantern up, not as a weapon, but as an offering of light. "It's all right. I'm here to help you." Slowly, cautiously, he coaxed the shivering man out from the culvert. Tarrare was weak, his movements clumsy. As he stumbled forward, he bumped against Dufour's arm, knocking the lantern from his hand. It fell with a clatter, rolling into the shallow, muddy water of the stream. The light sputtered, but it didn't go out. Instead, it illuminated something just beneath the surface of the water. Dufour reached down and pulled it out. It was a small, tattered piece of a child's blanket, stained with a dark, brownish red that could only be dried blood. His heart stopped. He swept the lantern's beam across the muddy bank. There, half buried in the muck, was a pair of men's boots, caked in filth, and next to them, a discarded leather wallet. Dufour's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was the identification of a hospital orderly, a man who worked in the morgue, a quiet, surly man, known for his heavy gambling debts. The truth crashed down on Dufour with the force of a physical blow. The impossible puzzle, the mystery that had pitted science against superstition, suddenly had a solution. And the solution was banal, human, and infinitely more evil than any demon. It wasn't a supernatural event. It was a kidnapping. A desperate man stealing a child for a ransom that must have gone horribly, tragically wrong. He had likely panicked and buried the poor child's body somewhere in these woods, discarding the evidence in his haste. Tarrare hadn't been drawn here by some demonic instinct. He had probably just been scavenging for scraps, as always, and stumbled upon this terrible scene. The superstition wasn't right about the cause, but it had been right about one thing. A monstrous force had been at work here. It just wore a human face. The Commandant's office was suffocatingly quiet. Lefebvre sat behind his desk, his face like granite. Baron Percy and a pale, shaken Sister Agnes stood to one side. Dufour strode into the room, Tarrare trailing behind him like a lost shadow. Dufour was no longer the hesitant, purely clinical man he had once been. His eyes burned with a cold, righteous fury. Without a word, he walked to the desk and laid out the evidence. The bloodied piece of blanket, the muddy boots, the orderly's wallet. "The child was not eaten," Dufour said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "She was stolen by one of your own men, a man desperate for money." He named the orderly. Guards were dispatched, and the man was dragged into the office moments later. He took one look at the items on the desk, and his face crumpled. The confession poured out of him in a torrent of pathetic, weeping cowardice. Sister Agnes let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth. She crossed herself, her eyes wide with the horror of her realization. Her certainty, her faith-fueled fear, had nearly led to the lynching of an innocent, sick man. Baron Percy looked at Dufour with a profound, quiet respect. But the Commandant was not relieved. He was furious. A murder and a kidnapping on his watch was a scandal. A riot was a scandal. A demon was a scandal. The entire affair was a stain on his command. He looked from the weeping orderly to the vacant-eyed Tarrare, the source of it all. "This story dies here," Lefebvre said, his voice dangerously low. "The orderly will hang for his crime, and this creature will be disposed of. His existence is an embarrassment to this army. Execute him at dawn. Bury the story with his body." Dufour stared at him, aghast. He had delivered the scientific truth, backed by irrefutable proof, only to come up against the most irrational and corrupt force of all, a bureaucrat protecting his reputation. He had defeated the ghost, only to find a far greater monster sitting behind the desk. The sky was a bruised purple, the first hint of pre-dawn light breaking over the horizon. At the far gate of the hospital, a lone civilian cart waited. Dufour, working with a silent, efficient Percy, gently loaded a heavily sedated Tarrare onto the straw in the back of the cart. Dufour had used his medical knowledge to administer the sedative, and his institutional knowledge to forge a perfect set of transfer papers, complete with the Commandant's signature. He was using the tools of the system to defy the system itself. He pressed a heavy purse of coins into the driver's hand. "Paris," Dufour said. "There is a hospital, l'Hôtel Dieu. Baron Percy has made the arrangements. Do not stop for anyone." The driver nodded, and with a flick of the reins, the cart rattled away into the grey mist, carrying its strange, tragic cargo toward a new life. Dufour stood alone in the gateway, watching until the cart was gone. He had sacrificed everything: his career, his rank, his reputation. He was a man stripped of all the things that had once defined him. But as the sun finally rose, casting its first golden rays on his face, he did not feel loss. He felt a profound sense of peace. He had looked into the abyss where science and superstition collide, and had emerged with a new, more compassionate wisdom. He had lost his world, but he had reclaimed his soul. It is easy to look at the end of Tarrare's story and say that science won. After all, the monster wasn't a demon, it was a desperate man. Dr. Dufour's rational worldview was ultimately proven correct. But the fascinating paradox here is that his science was powerless to find that truth. His experiments failed, his logic hit a dead end. It was only when he surrendered to the unscientific, when he used the map provided by Sister Agnes's folklore, that he was able to uncover the very human crime. So why was the superstition so powerful? Because in the face of a terrifying, senseless tragedy like a missing child, the story of a demon provided an answer. It gave fear a name and a face. It is an uncomfortable thought. A wrong explanation that feels right can be more compelling than a right explanation that feels incomplete or out of reach. In the end, Dufour didn't choose science over superstition. He learned to use one to navigate the other. He found the rational truth by following an irrational path. And that leaves us with a difficult question. Which do you think was the more dangerous force in this story? The mob-esque superstitious belief in a demon, or the Commandant's cold, rational desire for order at any cost?